Hello everyone, and welcome to this long time lapse of my painting entitled Midnight Wolf. I really hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're new, and let's begin the video. Now, this painting is the long awaited, or at least in my case because it's taken me a long time to edit this, the long awaited painting that has an underpainting in acrylic. And this was a very first opportunity for me to underpaint using acrylic and then paint on top using oils. And this is not a technique that I have invented. This is a technique that a lot of artists use, and it's also a technique that I've known about for a very long time. I just was quite, at least a long time ago when I first heard about it, I just thought to myself, I am never going to use this technique because I don't like the idea of mixing other types of paints in with my oil paints. And whilst I really enjoyed this experience, and I really think it is an amazing technique if you are pushed for time, and I think if ever I was to the point where I had no time left, I would actually use this technique. However, despite all that, I don't think I will ever change from my traditional oil painting technique, so using oil paints for the entirety of the painting, just because I actually couldn't think of a reason. I think it's something about the user experience and my actual feelings when painting, and I think that I just get some kind of magic when I'm blending using traditional oil paints right from the beginning of the painting, and it has nothing to do with the actual outcome, because I feel like the way that the acrylic underpainting looked really brought the colour out of my oils, and it really looked very amazing and beautiful at the end, especially the quality of the shades, the way the tones popped out from the canvas. I just thought it really looked lovely. And I don't think the camera ever picks up how good not necessarily my paintings, but anyone's paintings look in reality, because there is such a great quality to oils, and they really catch the light, especially if you've sort of spent a long time blending them out. So in this case, I feel like the camera doesn't do the painting justice at all, particularly towards the end, because I have one little clip at the end that was corrupted or something. Actually, I don't know whether it was corrupted. I uploaded it and I don't know where it's gone. I looked for it everywhere, so I basically lost it somewhere. So it might be lurking somewhere on my laptop, but I don't think so, because I tend to delete files very quickly. Sorry, this is a really boring interlude to what I was talking about. Anyway, back to the painting. So I started off by using black, white and grey, and this sort of teal, I think it must be cobalt teal. I think it just says teal on it, and it's by Liquitex, and I'm finding it very easy to blend out. I really like these acrylics. They're really lovely to blend. Liquitex are a very high quality brand, pretty expensive, but if you look in your sales, you might be able to find them more cheaply and get a nice bargain. The canvas panel I'm using is by Ampersand, and the size is 10 by 8, and this is quite an interesting size because you can create some really lovely work, even though it's not the biggest canvas. And I quite like to have these panels just about in case I get a sudden idea, but I don't want to do like a really big, sweeping, enormous landscape or something really complex. It's just a great way to kind of hone in your skills on a much smaller scale. So I really like it for that, and I think that it is a great size if you are a beginner as well, even though I still use them now and I'm not a beginner, but I think they are great to experiment on, and despite the fact that they're certainly not cheap. So I do always have some idea in mind that's going to become a fully fledged painting. I don't just kind of mess around on them because they're relatively expensive, but still they're good if you just want to do something to continue with your skills but not necessarily go so huge. Sometimes it's really time consuming to make enormous paintings. Even small paintings take me ages actually, but I always felt when I was growing up that you were supposed to, if you made a painting, it was supposed to be huge. and then you'd sort of get this enormous frame for it, and it would have to fill half somebody's wall. And I do think there is a great benefit in having art that is big, because if you're exhibiting, you do really want to create that type of scale. It really stands out in galleries. I feel whenever I go to a gallery, whenever I'm exhibiting, the gallery is so gigantic, and I still feel that my paintings are always dwarfed in comparison to other people's paintings, because I don't live next to these awesome galleries, unfortunately. And so when I have to travel with my work, when I'm having it put up on display, I therefore have to think about the transportation factor that always comes in, and it's a bit of a shame, really. I do really, really want to do enormous work in the future. I have always been intimidated by it, but I know that it is the way to gaining a lot of interest in your work, because if the gallery is huge and if your work is tiny, sometimes, and if there's other people's work on display as well, not if it's, a solo show, but if there's other people's work as well, your work can sometimes get lost within this sea of gigantic paintings. I believe I was actually listening to a really fascinating documentary about Gainsborough, just a super amazing artist. I know most of you probably know who he is, and he's a British artist, and really, really amazing. If you don't know, he created a lot of portraits. In fact, he wanted to be a landscape artist initially, but he didn't really have much success, so he went into portraiture. I believe he moved to Bath. That was where he found a lot of success, and he moved into portraiture. And he would create these really amazing, they're very wispy, romantic looking, almost fantastical paintings. They have not only the figure and obviously the British landscape, but there's something very ethereal in his execution of the work. And when he was exhibiting, I believe he exhibited, I'm not entirely sure whether it was National Gallery or Royal Academy, but when he exhibited, I think it must have been the Royal Academy, he was very offended by the way his paintings were sometimes on display, and the way that they were shown next to other people's paintings, because he felt that sometimes he didn't like the placement of where they were in the gallery. Now, I'm not kind of like that in a sense. I don't think that if my painting is put next to somebody else's that I think is brilliant, I think actually it's great, because I love to see great work, and I'd rather be in a gallery where everyone's work is of a really high standard. Having said that, I've never exhibited where the work has been terrible. It's always been of really high standard. But for me, if I see that my painting is placed next to another really good painting, then I think that is brilliant. I love that. But for him, I think that he felt when his work was placed next to really big works, I don't think he liked it. I think he wanted his work to really, really stand out. And because his work was of a certain style, perhaps next to other works that were perhaps different in colour, maybe he thought that his work kind of sank into the background. I don't know exactly his reasoning behind it. Well, that was just an interesting tiny bit of information about Gainsborough. And he had a great rival who was Joshua Reynolds, and they were both absolutely amazing artists, incredible, I think, and I love both of their works, so I would not necessarily say that one was better than the other. It's really about personal taste. Whenever I've looked into sort of who was more popular and who was more like, I think a lot of people remember Gainsborough more in England. Now, I don't know what the sentiment is across the globe, but whenever I mention Gainsborough, people know instantly who it is. And Joshua Reynolds, a lot of people know, but I think he's slightly less well known. I think now Gainsborough's popularity is growing even more than it used to, because he has a type of, his style as a type of universal appeal, I feel. And so it's very interesting to know who appeals directly to people and who doesn't. For example, I know that a lot of people find that Van Gogh is, for them, the artist that resonates with them the most. And I don't think I've ever met anyone who doesn't like Monet. I'd be curious to know if there is anyone out there. And I've sometimes seen online that some people don't like Impressionists, but whenever I've met other artists, I've never found an artist who didn't like Impressionism or Impressionists. And even though it's not my genre, like I don't paint in that style, I still find it amazing. Like, I find Impressionism beautiful to look at. I find it very calming, and I do have great respect for Impressionists past and present. So it's a very interesting conversation to have with people who really appeals to them. I should try and have this conversation more with people who are not artists, because I don't ever really bring it up as much as I should. Rather, I just, that phrase was all wrong. I mean, I don't bring it up as much as I should, because it is so interesting to know who is an individual's favourite artist if they're not somebody who paints or draws. And I actually once ran a poll on my Instagram to find out if people thought that Leonardo da Vinci was the best artist of all time, and it unfortunately failed because my Instagram stories wasn't working at that time. I don't know, it just malfunctioned, so we never found out the answer. Quite often when you see polls about who the greatest artist is of all time, Leonardo da Vinci comes at number one. But then I have met a lot of people who find the Mona Lisa super overrated. And it's really interesting, because I think if you know about an artist's life, you do tend to appreciate the art a heck of a lot more. And when I didn't know a lot about Da Vinci and the Renaissance artists and even the Impressionists, and even Van Gogh actually, I appreciated them less than when I actually learnt about them, and then I appreciated them much more because I found out all about them, and I learnt more about their work. I looked more into their work, because quite often an artist of the past tends to have a painting that represents them, and I think that the Mona Lisa represents Da Vinci completely. I mean, when people mention his name, that's normally the first thing that comes to mind. But he did so much more work than that, and he was an amazing inventor, and there's so many, his life was just fascinating, and his work is fascinating, but if you don't look into more about him, I suppose it's easy to dismiss his work, and I think that's why sometimes people think, why is that one painting worth so much money? Because they can't understand why. And obviously the whole aspect of the dimension of the painting and how it was so revolutionary at the time, the 3D quality that it had, is just one of the reasons. But yeah, it's just something that is, I think it should be taught more in school, because quite often in art history lessons you flit around lots of different artists and there'll be sort of a blurb about them, but there's never enough information. And I think there probably is now more so, because now you can just look up on Google or whatever, and that's great. It's such an amazing resource. So interesting how people's opinions differ. I mean, there is a rap battle on YouTube. I absolutely think rap battles are so fun to watch. They're brilliant. And there's a rap battle, I believe, with Picasso and Bob Ross. And this is what's so interesting and amusing, is that before I read the comments below the video, I naturally assumed that people would say that Picasso was the greatest artist, because I know so much about his life and I know so much of his work. But it was so unique to find that reading the comments, it was flooded with people who rated Bob Ross over Picasso, which is, again, it's such a fascinating concept, because when you're taught art and I mean, I've never been taught, I'm self-taught, but I did take some art classes at school and I did art for A-level, so I had that much studying, I guess. And at school you hear this word Picasso and you think, oh, it's this enigmatic figure who you're fascinated about, and then you learn so much more about him. I learned myself, but if you take art at university, you will learn about how he is the absolute master of innovation, and then and then when you see a rap battle and everyone is saying that Bob Ross is better than him, it's just so comical. I think it's actually brilliant because it shows that no matter how much you learn about somebody and have this opinion about somebody, there's always going to be other people who have a differing opinion, and I think that's what causes great conversation. And so also, I think a lot of people in the US grew up with Bob Ross. I believe he was on television. You see, I'm not so clued up about him. I heard about his name, and then when I came onto YouTube and started making my own videos, his videos were often in the recommended. I think they are on a lot of people's recommended because they have such a huge watch time. So people are always watching them and getting great tips from them. And so when I see them, I'm always so fascinated by it because it's not a technique or any kind of style that I was familiar with, and his personality is it's so nice, it's so engaging, and he seems like such a nice person. And so if it's someone like that, when you've grown up with them and they teach you that you can paint yourself. And I think that with Picasso, you're talking about someone who is somewhat impenetrable, because people would tell you that he is the absolute genius of all time and you can never become close enough to his level of genius. So I suppose there's a level of not being able to relate to that, I suppose. But it's just such an enormous cause for debate and what everyone thinks. And I don't really have a position either way. I think if someone who was to ask me who the greatest artist of all time if someone was to ask me who I preferred out of the two, obviously because I know so much about Picasso, I would say Picasso. But I haven't, I can't judge anyone who would say that they prefer Bob Ross, because if his art resonates with them, then why not? There's absolutely nothing wrong with thinking that way. I can imagine it would upset a lot of art connoisseurs. No, I think connoisseurs is the wrong word. Art critics. It would definitely upset some art critics. But there you are. Such an interesting contrast as well, because of an artist that you would think to compare, to pitch up against someone like Picasso. Bob Ross is so different. It's such an unusual choice. So it was really interesting to watch. And I suppose the equivalent would be in the UK. We had Tony Hart, and that he was to us absolutely amazing. But then after Tony Hart, there was sort of, for the generation younger than that, I'm not sure who it would be. Because even when I was growing up, Tony Hart was kind of on its way, his programmes were sort of ending. But I did used to catch his programmes, and I wish they could rerun them. They might do, actually. But I never really watch TV anymore. Not as much as I would like to. I also don't really watch series or any kind of Netflix or any of those things. I'm so archaic in my viewing choices, or rather it's very much based around either art documentary or any kind of documentary, actually, or movies, because I love movies, particularly old ones. And so people say to me, have you seen the most recent Game of Thrones, or there's lots of different other ones, and I just have absolutely no clue. I've never seen an episode of that. I don't know what people are talking about. I just oh yes, that sounds really great. It's almost like being at school, where you'd go to school and everyone had watched an episode of something, and if you hadn't seen it, you were completely left out. And I feel that way somewhat, but now I'm not too bothered, because I don't really... I think people are watching a lot of different types of genres, and whilst there are some people who stick to the kind of Netflix and things that are more popular, there are people who, like me, who just go on down their own path of randomness and look at subject matter that is not necessarily in the public consciousness but is appealing to them. So, and it's not that I dislike any series, it's just I know that if I start watching one of them, I'll get sucked into watching tons of series of things, and I do really feel like whenever I'm incredibly dull in this way, I feel like whenever I have a spare moment, I have to learn something. So if I'm not, unless I'm watching a movie to just relax, I will be instantly looking up some documentary about something or another, trying to fill my brain with information. I'm not sure how much gets retained, but it's just a feeling that a sentiment that I've had for quite some time. I think probably because I didn't have much training. Actually, I don't think it's that. I think it's just the way I am, and I've come to accept that I am a hopeless nerd, and I've just been destined to watch, fill my mind rather with information, whether it be useful or not. I hope it's useful. Most of the time I try to make sure it is. If you can see on this painting, I probably should have been talking about this painting, shouldn't I? I've tried to create as much depth with the trees. If you are somebody who doesn't know how to paint landscapes, this is a general rule. If you want to paint a forest, make sure that the trees in the foreground are darker and that they fade into the distance. It's the easiest concept and something that works, because in terms of perspective, if you're looking into a distance, the further things away, the more they sort of blur out to the eyes. You can even blur the background. I know some people love to do that, and I don't necessarily blur it all the time. In fact, I don't think I really blur it. I just fade it. That's just my technique, but you can blur it, and that also looks great. And it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes when you're looking into the distance, you can visually see everything clearly and nothing has faded into the background. But when you're looking at thinking about an enchanted forest with mist and lots of wild trees and mystery, then fading it and creating less colour, less pigment into the background is an aspect that really works. And when your subject is closer to you, then obviously the objects appear larger. Sometimes objects can be out of proportion. I think that can look great if you're working in surrealism. Obviously, if you're more of a hyper-realistic artist, you would want to make sure that you get everything in proportion, because otherwise, to your viewer, it will sometimes appear unrealistic. But this painting is unrealistic right from the outset, so it's okay to make everything a little bit out of key, out of sync. So if you have mushrooms that are supposed to be giant but they look a little bit less giant, then it's fine. You can have slightly less giant mushrooms. Some of them will be giant and some of them will be small too. And the story behind this painting called The Midnight Wolf, is all about this wolf that is very frightening to other people, and people avoid it because it has these kind of scary fang teeth and it looks quite menacing, and so people run away from it. They sort of find it terrifying. But at night it carries around this lantern and it sits amongst the trees in this forest. Now this forest is very kind of old and it's been damaged by weather, and a volcano has damaged it. So a lot of the trees are burnt out, a lot of the ground is all scorched, and there's very little growing there. But when this wolf comes at night, it lights its lantern, and then all the trees and the plants and the mushrooms and the cherry trees and the tomatoes and everything, vegetation all starts to grow again. So it's quite a magic wolf. It's a wolf, really, but it does look a little bit like a fox as well. it kind of looks a little bit like an Arctic fox, but it's not quite as fluffy. So it's fluffy-ish, but not completely fluffy like an Arctic fox. So there's the story, and I hope you like it. I really do love the idea of things that perhaps seem more terrifying than they really are. But then I also like the idea, the concept of animal or people or things that maybe seem good and wonderful on the outside, but are actually quite evil. And that's an idea that I've explored before in one of my dragon paintings, where I've explored that quite a lot. And I do think that it's a very interesting concept, because in life, very often, life does work that way, I think. And sometimes things that are scary are genuinely scary. But I find sometimes with animals, and very often people, I find, I feel that most people, when I meet them, they're really nice, and they are just nice, and they don't have any kind of terribleness. But you do sometimes meet some people, or you know some people for quite some time, and then they do seem like they are wonderful. But underneath all of that, actually, they're not wonderful at all. And it's this shiny veneer that has been coating this quite evil interior. And you only ever realise it until much later on. And it could be months, it could be years. You could know someone for years, and all of a sudden you realise and you see their true colours. So it's all that kind of concept that I find to be great to work in art. The idea of something not being as it seems always works really well in images, and obviously it works really well in stories, poetry, and so forth. And creating stories in painting is definitely a source of inspiration, because if you're trying to think of an idea or think of a painting, and if you're obsessed with the composition most of the time, that's normally what takes precedence over anything, then you can get lost in that and end up getting blocks. You can get blocks all the time, and there could be no reason, in fact. But one thing that's great about the story-based art is that the actual painting is a means to demonstrate the story. So whilst the actual composition is very important, the elements of the story, if you get the elements of the story in there as well, then you've created a successful painting, because it's given the viewer the information that they need. Now, I do realise that it's actually quite difficult to tell what the story is in this particular painting. However, adding the video with the story, like I'm giving it to you now, does help. But of course, because it's such a small canvas, it can be quite difficult to show that kind of action, and so it's just a still frame of what's happening. Of course, that's what's so great about animation, and the way that I always feel, and there's sort of Disney remakes coming out now, which makes me feel devastated. Apart from actually the two of them, the new ones, I believe it's Mulan and Ariel that actually look good to me. But the Disney remakes of the recent past, I haven't seen them, but I've seen the trailers, and kind of my heart has sunk about it, because I feel that when it comes to animation, it is in many ways one of the highest art forms, because you're taking both moving images, moving art, and adding a story, and that is such a brilliant and amazingly powerful visual visual storytelling. And so the fact that there's these live action remakes, it just takes away all of that. It takes away all of that art, and it just becomes more about either computer graphics or basically green screen work. And it does make my heart sink to see that, because if you want your child to see Aladdin or whatever it is, why not just show them the animation? Like, I just don't understand the reasoning behind it. I do think, though, that if they had made it into sort of live action and things, that they could have just made it an actual proper story. But I don't understand the addition of CGI, and they seem to be very much like carbon copies of the animated version. So to me, it just doesn't make any sense. I always feel that animation, because it's very much about the art as well as the story. I've never really understood why big productions see what they want to replace that. But I guess they make a lot of money, so there we are. And as you can see, I'm going over the acrylic. Now, what happened was the acrylic dried very fast. So the whole idea of doing an acrylic underpainting is that you are able to immediately paint over it, and you can see how beautifully this purple colour comes out. I mean, and the blues and the greens and everything, they're all coming out really, really strong on top of the acrylic. So the idea is, if you like to paint really fast and you need to paint really fast, this can be an amazing time saver. It also is almost exactly the same as using oils underneath, because very often when you're doing a number of different oil painting layers, the first few layers are in many ways the most kind of just blocking out, and they're not really any detailed with any detail at all. It's just kind of trying to establish the values. So this can save a ton of time. The reason that I don't feel it saves me a ton of time though is because after I'd completed the underpainting, I was too tired to finish, like to start oil painting on top of it, and I can't really complete an oil painting this way, as in several layers in a day. I can complete an oil painting if I'm doing one layer in a day, but if I'm doing like a ton of different layers, I have to spread it out over at least a few days, because for me it's just too tiring actually to do all of that, to create an entire underpainting and then to go back and go over it again. It's really, really a lot of energy, and it's very tiring for me. So that's why I don't think it will really end up saving me personally any time. But there are people who can do it, and kudos to them, because they've obviously got a lot more kind of art energy than I do. I guess I flounder after a while, and I also get not bored of it, but I just find it what's the word? I find it very monotonous. That's the perfect word. It's monotony, and it's too dull to just keep having to go over layers in the same sitting. So for me, I can't do it, but that's why I don't really gain anything by creating the underpainting in acrylic, because I'd rather just do the underpainting in oil, let it dry overnight, and then go back to it, because otherwise the acrylic underpainting would just sit there overnight and it's dry and it's not really doing anything. Like, so I might as well just do it in oil. You can see how beautifully the oil paints are coming out on top of the acrylic, so it's definitely worth doing if you love to save time and you really want to get your oil paintings done in one go. Again, I probably will try this technique again in the future. It's just that at the moment I can't see any benefits for myself. Have I said that about a ton of times? I think I have. And this is the point where I feel a little bit frustrated with myself that I lost the rest of this footage. I do not know where it went. There's still a large amount left. There's like 15 minutes of this. So if you think you're going to get let off, no, there's still more. But I don't understand where the rest of it went. Perhaps I deleted it. I have a feeling that that's what I did. So I can't blame my camera, I can't blame my laptop, I can only blame myself. And it's just typical for that to happen. I'm really interested to know who your favourite artist is, since I was pontificating about it earlier. When people ask me who my favourite artist is, I often say myself, which isn't true, by the way, because I have a significant loathing for some of my paintings. I often say myself because I don't actually know who my favourite artist is. I think there are so many artists that inspire me. In fact, there are very few artists that I don't like. I find that even artists that divide people, I can see qualities in them, in their work, that I admire. So it's a very hard conundrum. I think that there are some people who have artists that they just say, yes, they have inspired me 100%, and their work is, my work is a reflection of their work. But I can't say that I have one of those. And I think Leonardo da Vinci is one of the greatest artists of all time. I think he's also the greatest art inventor and one of the greatest inventors. Of course, that often goes by the wayside when discussing him. I think people discuss his art more than his inventions. Some people, I'd like to add. And I think that his work it definitely really inspires me. I think he's truly amazing. I would be interested to know also whether you think the Salvator Mundi is real or not, because that's a really controversial question. It's a really controversial topic, and if you don't know who or what the Salvator Mundi is, it is a painting supposedly by Leonardo da Vinci. Well, it is. I personally think it probably is by him, but there has been a lot of controversy about whether it is or not. I have to confess that when I first saw it, I didn't think it was by Leonardo da Vinci. It's a very different style, although it is in a similar style to some of his other work. I don't know exactly what it is about it, but it just jumped out to me as being unusual amongst his collection of work. I feel when you see a lot of his paintings, there's a uniformity there, and then this one does stand out a lot. Whether that means it's a fake or not, though, is a different question. And to me, what I think the reason behind it is that it probably has been restored a lot. It looks like to me like it's been restored to the point of perhaps unrecognisability in terms of his hand, Leonardo da Vinci's hand. If that could be the reason why it looks so different. But I still think that if it genuinely is by Da Vinci, it is worth the money. I mean, because his work is, I'm not saying it's worth the money, but it's fair enough that somebody paid that much. I don't actually think that art should be, that valuable, because I think that it's all then becomes so much more about the name as opposed to the skill. But obviously, because it is Da Vinci and he is such a master, and because of the history, I do understand why someone would pay that much. If I had tons of money, I don't think I would buy it, but that's just my personal point. And also, I don't have that much money, so I don't think I would ever be able to be in that position to make a decision, so that's my take on it. But incidentally, about the story, I didn't finish what it was about. So it is the depiction of Christ holding an orb, I believe, and the orb itself, I think that the orb is the aspect of it, again, that I just think it doesn't look very much like Da Vinci's work, because it just has a kind of different quality to how I think he would have painted it. That's just my personal interpretation. Now, I don't know what the critics' interpretations are of it, whether there are people who genuinely believe that it is by him or not. I think that obviously Christie's, I believe it was Christie's, one of these big auction houses, must be Christie's, believed it was by him. Yes, it is by Christie's, I think, because I just googled it and it says Christie's on the thing. But yes, that's the place where all these paintings get sold, and I believe that they obviously believe it. And there is a huge amount of research and an amazing amount of proof that is needed to sell any kind of painting by a famous artist at auction. You can't just pick up your painting at a mark it and then give it to the auction house and say, yeah, this is by this and this, which is what I thought, because back in the day, because I used to sometimes find paintings in markets and things and think, oh yeah, you know, it has the signature and it should be definitely by this person. But in actual fact, there is so much more detailed research. You need provenance, you need to have all the documentation of where the painting was before, or at least you need to have all the documentation of where you purchased it, and you need to know basically where the painting came from, which it makes sense, because no auction house is going to want to sell a fake. It causes them so much problems. It's really, really bad for them financially, but also their reputation. So I don't know, it's a really tricky one. And again, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, no way is that by Da Vinci. But now, when I've actually looked at the painting, and the fact that it did sell from Christie's has kind of convinced me. I don't know whether that's probably the way to think of it, but I do think that they have to go through so many tests to actually be verified by a particular famous artist, that I don't think it could slip under the net. But if it did, then that is one of the best forgeries, because to hoodwink so many people, I think, would be quite amazing. Obviously it's not to be praised, but it's just that it's, you know, very fascinating. I did actually see a programme about art forgery, and the amount of skill that goes into being able to forge is an art form in itself. I don't think it's good, obviously, but it's just it must have become more and more prevalent in the art world. There's so few really super famous artists that it's, in a way, and there's a lot of work that has gone missing. Think about anything in the Second World War. There's so many paintings that got lost during that era, so it's easy to look through the catalogues and see, okay, this is a lost painting by this artist or that artist, and then try to emulate it and stick it on the, you know, I don't know, somewhere, eBay. I don't know, I'm sure forgers would be smarter than that, but say if they did, and then say, oh, you know, this is a long lost piece, and then get someone to think, oh, maybe. And I think a lot of them now are doing artists that are not so well known but are still famous. So not necessarily Lowry, but I'm sure Lowry's too famous, but I'm trying to think of some British artists, perhaps even, I mean, yeah, I can't think of any artists that would be done a lot, but there are artists who are more kind of easier to forge, because people think, okay, that's only a few £100 and it might be by him or her, and then they get duped. And I think that Jackson Pollock is one that's forged a lot, because obviously you don't have to be that great an artist necessarily to be able to forge a Jackson Pollock. You just need to own a tin of paint and a big brush and then just like flick the paint on there. But of course it's very difficult to forge his work, because you'd have to get the flicks of paint exactly how Pollock did, and also to get his materials, his signature on the right place. And yeah, it's very, very hard, but a fascinating subject. And if you are interested, then I think they have a lot of these documentaries on YouTube. At least that's where I found them, you know, the amazing resource that is YouTube. And so here we are, reaching the kind of final destination of this painting, because sadly, rest in peace to the other the other video clips that got lost somewhere or another. And I really hope you enjoyed this video and me rambling on and on. It's a very long one. I've wanted to make a really long video for ages, and I finally got around to it. I can't quite believe it. So I hope you enjoyed this painting. Thank you so much for your beautiful comments again. I'm trying so hard to catch up, and I will get there. So thank you again, and stay awesome and amazing. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and stay magical, everyone. Take care.